How much of your brain do you actually use? 10%? 20%? What if that estimate is off by such an absurd margin that it changes everything you understand about yourself? The answer will bother you, and it comes with numbers. This 10% story became almost a universal truth. Movies repeat it, coaches repeat it, biology teachers who haven't kept up with the last 2 decades of research keep repeating it. The idea is comforting because it tells you that you have 90% of your power stored away, just waiting to be unlocked. But it was born from a misunderstanding. In the early 20th century, psychologist William James wrote that most people use only a small fraction of their mental and physical resources. He wasn't talking about a measurement of the brain. He was making an observation about human behavior. But the phrase got twisted, passed from mouth to mouth, and eventually became a round number that was easy to remember: 10%. When the first scientists began opening up brains and peering inside with microscopes, they saw that neurons, the cells that transmit electrical signals, occupied only a small portion of the total volume. The rest of the space was packed with glial cells. For decades, science treated these cells as packing material, a kind of glue that only served to support and feed the neurons, 90% of the brain, written off as packaging. Today we know that glial cells communicate with each other, modulate signals, and form networks of their own that science has barely begun to map. Then came the argument from modern skeptics. They say the 10% myth is nonsense because magnetic resonance imaging shows the entire brain lit up. Every region shows activity, even during sleep. Therefore, you already use 100% of your brain, just not all of it at the same time. That reasoning has an enormous problem. Activity is not the same thing as utilization. A 50-story office building can have all its lights on and its elevators running, but if there's only one person sitting inside doing mental arithmetic, you wouldn't say the building is being used to capacity. It's switched on, but empty. To investigate this in a way no conventional lab could, we use the axiom artificial intelligence, an artificial intelligence that models biological processes. The system cross-references neuroimaging databases, human connectome mappings, and magnetic resonance records from thousands of people across states ranging from deep sleep to extreme stress. We asked the system a direct question: what is the real utilization coefficient of the human brain when it processes reality? The result made the team review the data 3 times. It's not 10%. It's not even 1%. The calculation pointed to 0.01%. That sounds absurd until you look at the raw numbers. Every second, your eyes, ears, skin, and every other sensory receptor pour billions of bits of information into the brain. You pick up photons of light, sound waves, temperature fluctuations, atmospheric pressure, the texture of every thread of clothing touching your skin. It's an unrelenting flood of data. And how much of it reaches your awareness? Studies in cognitive neuroscience converge on a number that ranges between 40 and 60 bits per second, 60 bits against billions. The gap between what enters the brain and what you actually perceive is on the order of millions of times. If that were all, it would already be hard to accept. But there's another piece of data that makes things even more complicated. Your brain weighs roughly 2% of your body mass, yet it consumes 20% of all the energy you get from food. In infants, that consumption climbs to 60%. Evolution is the most brutal cost-cutting system in nature. Any organ that burns energy without delivering a return gets eliminated over the generations. Cave fish lose their eyes. Muscles that go unused shrink and disappear. If the brain is burning 1/5 of all your energy, it's doing something heavy with it. But we don't have access to that activity. The analysis showed that the brain doesn't discard the information it blocks from consciousness. It processes everything. It builds predictive models, calculates probabilities, anticipates what will happen in the next second and perhaps far beyond that. It just hides those calculations from you. All that machinery running in silence, consuming energy, generating results you never see. So there's a question left that you can't ignore. If the brain does all this heavy lifting behind the scenes and spends a massive share of energy on it, why does it block nearly everything from your conscious access? What's the point of such a radical blockade? This barrier isn't accidental. It carries a name, a structure, and a reason for existing that goes far beyond what conventional neuroscience typically acknowledges. To understand why this blockade exists and what it's holding back, we need to go inside a single neuron. It's there at a level that most neuroscientists overlooked for decades that things get truly strange. In school you learned a simplified version. A neuron is a cell that transmits electrical signals. There's the axon, which is the long wire, and the dendrites, which are the receivers. The signal runs along, reaches the synapse, releases chemical substances, and the next neuron fires. On or off. Every piece of artificial intelligence that humanity has built to this day was based on that logic. We copied that design, stacked layers of artificial neurons, and thought we had understood the brain, but we only copied the shell. Inside each neuron, there's something that biology treated as the cell's skeleton, something that merely held the shape in place. This structure is called the cytoskeleton, made of microtubules, tiny hollow cylinders composed of a protein called tubulin. For a long time, nobody paid them any attention. They seemed to serve a mechanical function and nothing more. When Axiom modeled the internal structure of the microtubules, the system flagged an alert for high internal complexity. These cylinders aren't simple scaffolding. They're built with mathematical precision that follows Fibonacci patterns, the same sequence that appears in seashells, sunflowers, and galaxies. They're hollow on the inside and form networks throughout the entire neuron. The question no one asked for far too long is simple. Why would nature create something so sophisticated inside a cell just to maintain its shape? That would be like using diamond to make a broomstick. In the 1990s, physicist Roger Penrose and anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff put forward a hypothesis that the academic world treated as delusional. They proposed that microtubules are not passive structures, they are quantum processing units. That consciousness doesn't arise from the chemical exchange between neurons, but from quantum vibrations inside these minuscule tubes. The scientific community laughed at them for 30 years. The counter-argument was direct and seemed definitive. Quantum effects only work near absolute zero, and the brain is warm and wet. Any quantum coherence would be destroyed in fractions of a second in there, but the modeling revealed something no one expected. The water that exists inside the microtubules doesn't behave like normal water. It enters a state called an ordered phase, where the molecules align into rigid chains, forming a kind of shield that insulates the interior of the tube from heat and external noise. Inside your neurons right now at 36.6 degrees Celsius, there are pockets of perfect quantum silence, protected environments where quantum coherence can be sustained. When you count each neuron as a single unit of computation, the brain performs something in the range of 10 to the power of 16 operations per second. That's a big number, but the most recent supercomputers are getting close to it. Now, if the unit of computation isn't the entire neuron but each tubulin molecule inside the microtubules, and each one can toggle between quantum states, the math changes radically. The number jumps to 10 to the power of 27 operations per second. To put that in perspective, it's more than the combined capacity of every computer on the planet multiplied by 1,000. All of that inside your head. But microtubules aren't just powerful at calculation. They vibrate. They vibrate in ranges from terahertz to kilohertz, creating complex synchronized patterns. The phenomenon has a name in physics. It's called orchestrated objective reduction, and the implication is gut-wrenching. If microtubules function as frequency receivers, the brain doesn't generate consciousness. It picks it up. It's like a radio. You tune into a station and sound comes out of the speaker. If you smash the radio, the sound stops. But the radio wasn't creating the music. The music carries on through space, riding electromagnetic waves regardless of the device. Strong confirmation of this comes from an unexpected place: anesthesia. Doctors have been using anesthetics for over 150 years, yet to this day no one has explained, with total precision, why they switch off consciousness. What was discovered is that anesthetic molecules don't shut neurons down completely. Neurons keep emitting faint electrical signals even under narcosis. What the anesthetic does is lock the vibration of the microtubules. It halts the quantum movement inside the tubulin. The instant that vibration ceases, consciousness goes dark. The body carries on, the heart beats, the lungs breathe, but you're no longer there. So what we have is a scenario where billions of microscopic antennas vibrate inside each neuron, processing information at a scale that makes any machine look like an abacus, and the vast majority of those antennas are operating at a level that our consciousness simply cannot reach. 0.01% isn't a measure of weakness. It's a measure of how much of that enormous activity is locked behind a barrier we didn't even know existed. That barrier has a very specific function. It filters reality before it reaches you. And it does so with such staggering efficiency that you spend your entire life believing the world you see is the world that exists. It isn't. The electromagnetic spectrum stretches from radio waves the size of buildings to gamma radiation smaller than the nucleus of an atom. If you laid that spectrum out like a strip running for kilometers and went looking for the slice your eyes can detect, visible light, you'd find a sliver so thin you could barely see it. We are blind to nearly everything around us. Right now, billions of neutrinos, radio waves, satellite signals, and gravitational oscillations are passing through your body. A dog senses smells you don't even know exist. A bat hears a symphony of ultrasound that to you is silence. Your brain knows this information is out there. The body's receptors pick up a good deal of it, but none of it reaches your perception. Axiom calls this mechanism the interface simplification protocol. It's like a computer screen. You see a little blue folder called the recycle bin, but inside the computer there's no little basket. There's a complex chain of electrical signals running through silicon chips. If the screen showed you that reality, you couldn't even delete a file. The folder is a shortcut, so you can interact with something that in its real form would be incomprehensible. Your brain does the same thing with everything. The chair you're sitting in is a simplification. The person you love is a simplification. They're representations the brain assembles in fractions of a second, so you can navigate a universe that, at the atomic level, is 99% empty space. If you removed all the empty space from the atoms of every human being on Earth, humanity would fit inside a sugar cube. But you don't feel emptiness, you feel solidity. The brain manufactures that sensation using electromagnetic repulsion between atomic fields and delivers it to you as reality. And it goes further. There's a lag between what happens and what you perceive. The path of a light signal from the retina to the visual cortex passes through the optic nerve, through the thalamus, through relevance filters, before it arrives at the area that assembles the image. That journey takes an average of 150 milliseconds, sometimes half a second. It sounds like nothing, but it's an eternity in terms of neurophysiology. You're never seeing the now. You're always seeing what already happened. If a rock is falling toward you, you don't see where it is at that instant. You see where it was 150 milliseconds ago. So why can you dodge it? Because the brain predicts. It calculates the trajectory, extrapolates the likely position, and shows you a projection of where the rock will be. You see a prediction plastered over a memory. The present moment slips through between those two processes without you ever having access to it. There's more. Your eyes are constantly moving with rapid movements called saccades, several times per second. During each saccade, the image on the retina becomes an unusable blur. If you saw that honestly, your visual experience would be a sequence of cuts and flashes, but you see a smooth panorama. Because during the saccades, the brain switches off the visual input, erases the image for those milliseconds, and fills the gap with the last saved frame. Add up those micro-blindnesses over the course of a day, and you spend roughly 40 minutes awake without seeing a thing, and you never noticed. So why did evolution build such an elaborate scheme of deception? Wouldn't seeing the truth be a better advantage for survival? Axiom simulated an evolutionary competition between two groups of virtual creatures. The first group perceived reality as it truly is. Quantum fields, atomic structures, the full complexity of the environment. The second group saw simplifications, basic shapes, warning colors, markers for danger or food. The outcome was the same in 100% of the simulations. The group that saw the truth was wiped out. While a creature from that group was processing the atomic composition of a predator, the predator had already devoured it. The creature from the other group saw a big shape with teeth and ran. Speed beat accuracy every single time. We descend from those who learn to ignore the truth in exchange for speed. Aldous Huxley called this mechanism the reducing valve. It compresses the immense flow of information from the universe until it fits through the narrow straw we call consciousness. The brain doesn't produce your thoughts from nothing. It filters them from a much larger field, cutting everything that doesn't serve the immediate task of staying alive and passing on your genes. But that valve isn't perfect. It has flaws, and when it fails, when something forces its way through that narrow straw, what the person sees on the other side doesn't resemble anything that words can describe. There are people who live with that valve broken. Science labels most of them as carriers of syndromes, disorders, or rare conditions. Many can't tie their shoes, don't understand irony, and struggle with basic daily tasks. But some of those very same people can do things no human considered normal has ever come close to achieving. A man flies over a city in a helicopter for 20 minutes. Then he lands, picks up a pencil and a huge sheet of paper, and starts drawing. Not a sketch, not an artistic impression. He draws every building, every window, every antenna. The number of columns on the facade of a museum matches reality. The floors of each building are correct. The final result is photographically precise. The conventional explanation says this man has an extraordinarily unusual visual memory. Axiom's analysis says something different. His data compression system simply doesn't work. When you look at a city, your mind simplifies everything. It registers the generic idea of building and discards the details because they're not relevant to your survival. It doesn't matter how many windows that building has. All that matters is that a building is there. The brain saves energy by creating labels and throwing away the raw information. His mind doesn't do that. It doesn't create labels. It doesn't discard anything. Every line, every angle, every shadow is recorded as an individual data point. He doesn't see the category building. He sees the thing itself with all its complexity, as if his eyes were recording everything at maximum resolution while yours record in a compressed, low-quality format. The region responsible for this filtering has been identified. It sits in the left anterior temporal lobe, an area that governs categorization, logic, and the suppression of information deemed irrelevant. In many savants, this zone is damaged or operates with reduced activity. It sounds counterintuitive, but the way out isn't to add something extra to the brain, it's to take something away. The break. Another case shows this from a different angle. There are people who can answer in half a second which day of the week corresponds to any date in history, including dates thousands of years in the future. No mental formula exists that's fast enough to explain that speed. They don't calculate, they see. For these people, time isn't a line, it's a three-dimensional landscape. They look at a point in that landscape and read the answer. This is called synesthesia, a condition where the senses cross over. For a synesthete, the number 5 might be red and taste like cherry. 9 might be tall, cold, and blue. For them, mathematical operations become colorful shapes fitting together in space. When they multiply 6-digit numbers, they see 2 enormous figures merging into a third, and the result appears as the only possible shape in that void. Your brain does those calculations too. When you catch a ball in midair, it solves differential equations of trajectory factoring in wind, gravity, and air resistance, all in fractions of a second, without you knowing a single line of math. The difference is that it doesn't show you the calculation. It only shows you the ball flying. The savant sees the calculation behind it. The strongest proof that this potential exists inside every person is the phenomenon of acquired savantism. Ordinary people, bricklayers, salespeople, accountants, who suffered a head injury survived and when they woke up were a different person. A man who had never touched an instrument sat down at the piano and began improvising complex pieces. Another who hated school started seeing fractal geometry in tree branches, puddles, and clouds, and drawing it with obsessive precision. The trauma didn't teach these people anything. No blow to the head installs knowledge of music theory or advanced mathematics. What the impact did was damage the inhibitory centers of the left hemisphere, the same ones that function as the reducing valve. With the valve partially destroyed, the right hemisphere, older, more visual, and far more powerful in terms of raw processing, broke free. Scientists tested this in controlled settings with transcranial magnetic stimulation. They placed coils on volunteers' heads and temporarily suppressed activity in the left anterior temporal lobe. Students who couldn't draw began making strokes with correct proportions. The ability to perceive details improved several times over. The effect lasted about an hour. Then normalcy returned. This shows that genius works more like a configuration that every human brain possesses than an exclusive gift, but one that stays suppressed so we can function in society. We need to ignore details to understand language, need to suppress information to recognize faces, need to be average in order to be social. Savants pay for their expanded perception with enormous difficulties in daily life. Many don't grasp sarcasm, metaphor, or lies. They live in a world of raw data, without the filters that make coexistence possible. Raw truth and social comfort don't fit in the same space. If these capacities exist inside any brain, locked behind filters that can be switched off by a trauma or a magnetic field, then the question changes direction. The potential is there. That much is already obvious. The question now is different. Where is the instruction to access it written? The answer is in every cell of your body. It's in your DNA. But not in the part science studied for half a century. It's in the part science threw in the trash. In the 1970s, geneticist Susumu Ono coined the term junk DNA to describe something that bothered everyone. Of the entire human genome, with 3 billion base pairs, only 2% codes for proteins, the building blocks that construct muscles, organs, and neurotransmitters. The logic seemed obvious. If a stretch of DNA doesn't manufacture protein, it's useless. The other 98% was classified as remnants of ancient viruses, defective copies, errors accumulated over millions of years. Genetic junk we carry around because there's no mechanism to get rid of it. That conclusion was one of modern biology's greatest mistakes. Axiom analyzed the entire genome as if it were information, a text in an unknown language, and not merely chemistry. The system applied Zipf's law, which measures the frequency distribution of words in any natural language. If the non-coding DNA were random noise, it wouldn't pass that test. But it did. With complex grammatical structure, patterns that follow rules, hierarchies reminiscent of syntax. The 98% isn't junk. It's a text we haven't yet learned to read. The 2% science knows well is basically a parts list. Build a liver, build hemoglobin, build a neuron. It's the inventory of materials, but the remaining 98% is the assembly and operations manual. It's the instructions for how to use those parts, when to switch each one on, in what order, at what intensity. It's in this part of the genome that the switches for the abilities we saw in savants are found. In people with hyperthymesia, who can remember every day of their lives as though they had just lived it. And in every manifestation of human power that science treats as an anomaly. The analysis identified clusters of dormant instructions within that file. The first has to do with regeneration. Salamanders regrow an entire limb complete with bones, nerves, and perfect muscles. Humans can only close cuts with scar tissue, but the genes for complete regeneration exist in our DNA, intact, in the part they called junk. The switch is turned off. The mechanism that would allow an adult cell to revert to a stem cell state is present, but blocked by chemical markers called methyl groups, molecular padlocks. The second cluster is even harder to swallow. Sequences were found in the non-coding DNA that resemble those controlling echolocation in dolphins and electroreception in sharks. The ability to sense electrical fields in water. In humans, these sequences aren't linked to the skin. They're linked to the brain. They form the genetic basis for those microtubule antennas that vibrate at quantum frequencies. The instruction to build ultra-high sensitivity receivers inside neurons exists in our code. The promoters of these sequences, the stretches that should issue the activation command, are silenced. There's one more detail that changes the story. Roughly 8% of the human genome is made up of viral fragments, ancient retroviruses that infected our ancestors millions of years ago, integrated into the DNA, and stayed passed down from generation to generation. Science treated these stretches as inert fossils, but some of them are very much alive. The ARC protein, essential for long-term memories, has a viral structure. It packages genetic material and transports it from neuron to neuron in viral capsules. Without it, you wouldn't form lasting memories. Part of what makes you human came from an invader, and the genome isn't static. Inside it are transposons which Barbara McClintock discovered and which earned her the Nobel Prize. They're stretches of DNA that cut themselves from one location and paste themselves into another, reorganizing the code on their own. In the brain, this process happens with particular intensity. Every time you learn something new or go through an intense experience, your neurons rewrite stretches of their own DNA. During peak moments, moments of insight or altered states of consciousness, transposon activity spikes. The brain tries new combinations, searching for keys that will unlock the sealed files. Sometimes it gets it right. A genius is born. Sometimes it gets it wrong, and the result is a neurological collapse. The line between genius and breakdown, at the DNA level, is almost the same door, opened successfully or broken down by force. What's stored in that genetic file is no small thing, and the most unsettling part is that the instruction to access all of it doesn't need to come from outside. It's already written inside you, across 98 pages that nobody has read. All of this concerned an isolated brain. What happens inside a single head? But no brain operates alone. And when you discover what happens between two brains that connect, the scale of what's locked away grows far larger. In the 1990s, Italian scientists found an unexpected type of neuron in monkey brains. These cells fired not only when the animal picked up an object, but also when it merely watched another do the same thing. For the brain, there was no difference between doing and seeing. They were called mirror neurons, and in humans, this network is far more developed. It covers not just movements, but emotions and pain. When you see someone stub their little toe on the corner of a piece of furniture, you wince. You feel an echo of that pain in your own body. Your mirror neurons are simulating the other person's state inside you. That's the biological basis of empathy. But Axiom's analysis shows it's only the surface. Mirror neurons are the visible tip of a communication system between brains that operates through channels conventional science still resists accepting. Experiments conducted at Princeton and at the Institute of Noetic Sciences placed two people in separate rooms, insulated by soundproof walls and shielded against electromagnetic fields. One of them received visual stimuli, flashes of light or emotionally charged images. In the same fraction of a second, the other person, seeing nothing, registered on the electroencephalogram an identical spike of activity in the same region of the brain. No contact, no signal, no delay. Identical twins take this to a documented extreme. They share the same DNA and the same neural architecture. There are records of one twin breaking a leg in one country, while the other, on the other side of the world, feels a sharp pain in the same leg at the same instant. For these brains, synchronized since conception, distance appears not to exist. This phenomenon isn't limited to pairs. Flocks of thousands of starlings execute synchronized maneuvers that defy any explanation based on sound or visual signals. There's no leader calling out commands. The reaction propagates faster than sound. The flock behaves as a single organism, and human beings, in moments when the connection between brains intensifies, do the same. There's a project called the Global Consciousness Project, which has scattered random number generators around the world. These devices produce sequences of zeros and ones that, by definition, should show no pattern. But during events that capture the attention of billions of people at once, the graphs deviate from randomness. The numbers begin to synchronize, as though a collective wave of human attention were bending the odds. In some of those events, the anomaly began hours before the event actually took place. Something in the collective field already knew. We use this connection all the time without realizing it. We call it intuition, when we sense that something is off in a room where everyone is smiling, but just had a fight. We call it coincidence when we think of someone, and that person calls. We call it chemistry when two strangers hit it off effortlessly. These are names we give to a phenomenon we can't explain, but one that happens far too often to be chance. Now combine that invisible network between brains with another illusion that governs your entire existence: time. You believe time is a constant, that an hour is an hour for everyone, that it always flows forward at the same speed. But anyone who's ever been in an accident knows that's not true. People who've rolled their car describe shards of glass floating in slow motion. They say they had time to think about 1,000 things while the car was spinning. It's not a trick of memory. The brain, in situations of extreme danger, releases a cascade of neurotransmitters that increases the rate of information capture. On an ordinary day, you perceive the world at about 60 frames per second. In an accident, that rate can jump to 1,000. For someone on the outside, 1 second passed. For the person inside, a minute went by. And this explains a phenomenon that haunts every adult. Why does time speed up as you age? When you were a child, summer seemed to last forever. Every day was a different adventure. Now the years fly by like pages turned by the wind. The reason is neurological, not mathematical. A child's brain is in constant recording mode because everything is new. Every experience creates novel neural connections, and the record is dense, rich in detail. The adult brain, living in the routine of home to work and work to home, recognizes the patterns and stops recording. It marks the day as a repeat and moves on. You feel like time has sped up because your mind erased most of what happened. Your years are getting shorter because you stopped living things worth remembering. Time didn't speed up. You just became too predictable for your own brain to bother recording. And while the brain loses the habit of recording, something is actively working to make it record even less. That something isn't hidden. It's in your pocket, on your nightstand, in the palm of your hand right now. Over the last 20 years, the average IQ level in developed countries has started to drop. For the first time since intelligence has been measured, the curve reversed. Researchers call this the reverse Flynn effect. But the problem goes beyond tests. Neuroimaging scans comparing the brains of today's teenagers with those of people the same age in the 1980s show a thinning in the cortex of the frontal regions, precisely the areas that control willpower, planning, and impulse regulation. Every notification on your phone, every like, every short video releases a small dose of dopamine, the same neurotransmitter involved in cigarettes and gambling. But in the digital world, that dose comes without effort. All it takes is a flick of the finger. The brain learns fast. If it can get instant pleasure with a single touch, why would it invest energy in long reading or solving difficult problems? It rewires its connections, cuts the pathways for concentration because they're expensive and don't deliver an immediate reward. The average span of sustained attention has dropped to 8 seconds, less than that of a goldfish. Axiom cross-referenced digital consumption data with markers of brain activity and identified a spiral of cognitive impoverishment. You outsource your memory to your phone, and the hippocampus shrinks. You outsource spatial navigation to the GPS, and the navigation networks atrophy. You outsource calculation to the calculator, and lose the ability to estimate. What's left is the function of consuming content and reacting to stimuli. Eyes scrolling a screen, a finger that swipes. Every time a pause appears, in the elevator, in line, in the bathroom, you fill it with the phone. And in that gesture, you kill the one thing that could save your brain: boredom. When the mind has nothing to do, it activates the default mode network. That's the state where improbable connections happen, where distant ideas meet, where solutions appear out of nowhere. Every great idea in history was born in a moment of apparent inactivity, but boredom has become unbearable. The brain addicted to quick dopamine can't tolerate 5 seconds without a stimulus. Then there's the destruction of sleep. Blue light from screens blocks melatonin. You sleep less, you sleep worse. During sleep, the brain clears toxins and transfers information to long-term memory. Without quality sleep, neurons in the hippocampus die. You become a little less intelligent with every poorly slept night. And what if we reversed all of it? What if, instead of letting the mind sink into the spiral, we forced the opposite direction? The simulation modeled what would happen if the human brain were pushed to operate at 1% of its total capacity. The result isn't pretty. Body temperature would spike to 42 degrees Celsius within seconds, and proteins would begin to denature. The perception filters would all drop at once. The person would stop seeing objects and start perceiving energy fields, would hear other people's thoughts as a deafening roar, and would feel the pain of every living being nearby. Past, present, and future would merge into a single point. The identity, the little self you call yourself, wouldn't have the structure to contain that much information. It would dissolve. That explains why so many geniuses and visionaries throughout history ended up in collapse. Their brains brushed against that power for an instant. Those who survived the contact brought back with them symphonies, equations, and visions that changed civilizations. Those who couldn't handle the voltage burned out. So here's the picture. We have a brain with 86 billion neurons, each one packed with microtubules vibrating at quantum frequencies, connected to other brains through an invisible network, carrying a genome where 98% of the instructions are locked away. A piece of equipment built for something we don't even have a name for yet, and most of humanity uses that equipment to scroll a screen with their thumb, 0.01%. At first, that number felt like an insult. Now it feels like an invitation, because if all of this is in there, running in silence, waiting, then the number doesn't mark a limit. It marks a starting point. The brain that burns 20% of your energy to deliver you almost nothing in conscious perception is doing something else with that energy, something you haven't accessed yet. Something savants touch by accident, twins feel across distances, children perceive before they learn to ignore it, something written across the pages of your DNA that nobody has read. The question that remains isn't whether the potential exists. That much is already clear. The question is what you're going to do knowing it's there. If you liked this investigation, subscribing to the channel helps us expand the Axiom Investigation project. We would love to read your thoughts on the video's subject in the comments and your suggestion for the next topic to be covered. Tell us which city you are watching from. Thank you for staying with us until the end.